The morning light filtered through the grand windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the marble floors where young Prince William stood adjusting his ceremonial uniform. His hands trembled slightly as he fastened the golden buttons, each one carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. Today was not just any day. It was the coronation that would change everything for his family, and the entire nation watched with bated breath. William's wife, Catherine, sat at the antique dressing table, her reflection showing a woman who had grown from a commoner into royalty through sheer determination and grace. Her fingers worked carefully through their daughter Charlotte's hair, creating the perfect braids that would hold the small tiara gifted by the Queen. Charlotte, now 8 years old, fidgeted in her silk dress, unaware that this day would be remembered in history books for generations to come. "Mummy, why does everyone look so serious today?" Charlotte asked, her innocent eyes meeting Catherine's in the mirror. The question hung in the air like morning mist, carrying more weight than a child could understand. Catherine's heart clenched as she searched for words that could explain the magnitude of what was happening without frightening her daughter. "Today is very special, darling," Catherine replied softly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her chest. "Grandpa Charles is becoming king, which means our family has very important responsibilities now. People all around the world will be watching us, and we need to show them how much we care about everyone in our country." Prince George, their eldest at 10 years old, stood near the window watching the crowds gathering outside. Even from this distance, he could see the sea of people stretching as far as his young eyes could reach. Some carried flags, others held photographs, but all shared the same expression of anticipation mixed with uncertainty. The boy understood more than his siblings about what this day meant, and the responsibility already weighed heavily on his small shoulders. "Dad," George called to William, his voice carrying a maturity that shouldn't belong to someone so young. "There are so many people out there. What if we make a mistake? What if we're not good enough for them?" William crossed the room and placed his hands on his son's shoulders, looking out at the same crowd that filled his own heart with both pride and terror. The questions his son asked were the same ones that had kept William awake for weeks leading up to this moment. How do you prepare a child for a life where every action is scrutinized, every word analyzed, every emotion judged by millions of strangers? "You know what your great-grandmother once told me?" William said, kneeling down to meet George's eyes directly. "She said that being royal isn't about being perfect. It's about showing people that even when life is difficult, even when we're scared or sad or confused, we can still choose to be kind, to help others, and to never give up hope." The memory of Queen Elizabeth's words brought both comfort and pain to William's heart. She had passed away just 6 months ago, leaving behind a legacy that seemed impossible to match. Her wisdom, her unwavering dedication, her ability to bring comfort to people during their darkest hours. These were the standards by which William's family would now be measured. Little Prince Louis, barely 5 years old, ran into the room wearing his miniature military uniform, completely oblivious to the gravity of the situation. His infectious laughter filled the space as he pretended to march like the soldiers he'd seen practicing outside. For a moment, the family's tension melted away as they watched their youngest member find pure joy in what was, to him, simply an elaborate game of dress-up. "I'm going to wave to everyone," Louis announced, climbing onto a chair to reach the window. His enthusiasm was so genuine, so untainted by the complexity of their situation, that it reminded them all why they were doing this in the first place. It wasn't about the crowns or the ceremonies or the ancient traditions. It was about serving people who needed hope, guidance, and someone to believe in. Catherine stood and smoothed down her elegant navy dress, the same color she'd chosen deliberately to honor the Queen's memory. Every detail of her appearance had been planned months in advance, from the sapphire earrings that once belonged to Princess Diana to the subtle makeup that would photograph well under the intense lights of Westminster Abbey. But beneath all the careful preparation, she was simply a mother trying to protect her children from a world that would never see them as just kids. "Remember what we practiced," William said to all three children as they gathered near the door. "We walk together, we stand together, and no matter what happens, we support each other. If anyone feels overwhelmed, just look for Mummy or me, and we'll be right there." The children nodded solemnly, understanding that this wasn't like the rehearsals they'd done in the palace gardens. Today, the entire world would be watching their every move, analyzing their expressions, judging their behavior. The pressure was enormous, even for adults who had spent years preparing for public life. As they made their way through the palace corridors toward the waiting cars, William's mind wandered to his mother, Princess Diana. How he wished she could be here today to see her grandchildren, to offer her guidance during this monumental transition. Diana had always told him that the most important part of being royal was remembering the people behind the titles. The struggling families, the lonely elderly, the children who needed someone to believe in their dreams. The corridor walls were lined with portraits of previous monarchs, each face telling a story of triumphs and tragedies, of personal sacrifices made for the greater good. William paused for a moment in front of a painting of King George VI, remembering the stories of how that shy, stuttering man had found the courage to lead his people through the darkest days of World War II. If he could overcome his fears and insecurities, perhaps there was hope for William's own family. Catherine noticed her husband's hesitation and slipped her hand into his, their fingers intertwining with the practiced ease of two people who had weathered many storms together. They had met as university students, fallen in love as ordinary young people, and now found themselves at the center of one of the most watched events in modern history. The journey from their simple flat in Wales to this moment had been filled with challenges that would have broken many relationships, but somehow they had emerged stronger. "Are you ready for this?" Catherine whispered as they approached the palace doors. "I don't think anyone could ever be truly ready for something like this," William replied honestly. "But we have each other, and that's enough." The sound of the waiting crowd grew louder as they stepped outside, a wall of noise that included cheers, applause, and the constant clicking of thousands of cameras. The children instinctively moved closer to their parents, overwhelmed by the intensity of attention focused entirely on them. This was their first real taste of what their lives would be like from now on. Always observed, always judged, always expected to be perfect examples of grace under pressure. The car ride to Westminster Abbey passed in relative silence, each family member lost in their own thoughts about what the day would bring. Through the bulletproof windows, they could see crowds lining every street, some people having camped out for days just to catch a glimpse of the royal family. The dedication of these strangers was both humbling and terrifying, representing millions of people whose hopes and dreams were somehow tied to this ancient ceremony. George pressed his face to the window, watching the faces of the people they passed. Many were smiling and waving, but he could also see tears in some eyes, expressions of grief for the queen they had lost mixed with uncertainty about the future. At 10 years old, he was beginning to understand that being royal meant carrying the emotions and expectations of an entire nation, a responsibility that would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. As Westminster Abbey came into view, its Gothic spires reaching toward the gray London sky, the magnitude of what was about to happen hit them all at once. Inside those ancient walls, William's father would be crowned King Charles III, officially beginning a new era for the British monarchy. And with that coronation, William's family would step into roles that would define not just their own futures, but the future of an institution that had existed for over 1,000 years. The car slowed as they approached the Abbey, and Catherine squeezed William's hand one final time before they would have to step out into the glare of the world's attention. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges they would face, whatever mistakes they might make, they would face it together as a family. And in that unity, perhaps they would find the strength to honor the memory of those who came before while building something meaningful for the generations yet to come. The ancient doors of Westminster Abbey opened like the gates to history itself, revealing an interior that had witnessed nearly 1,000 years of royal ceremonies. William felt his breath catch in his throat as he stepped inside, the weight of tradition pressing down upon his shoulders like an invisible crown. The abbey was filled to capacity with dignitaries, world leaders, and members of the Commonwealth, all rising to their feet as the royal family made their entrance. Catherine walked beside him with a grace that had made her beloved by people around the world. But William could see the slight tension in her jaw, the careful control she maintained over every expression. Behind them, their 3 children followed in perfect formation, their small faces serious as they absorbed the magnitude of the moment. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the stone walls, mixing with the hushed whispers of 2,000 guests and the distant hum of television cameras broadcasting this moment to billions of viewers worldwide. George's eyes darted around the abbey, taking in the familiar faces of relatives mixed with strangers whose names he'd studied in preparation for this day. Presidents, prime ministers, kings, and queens from distant lands, all gathered to witness his grandfather's transformation from prince to king. The boy's hand trembled slightly as he walked, remembering his father's words about showing strength even when feeling afraid. Charlotte maintained her perfect posture despite the heavy tiara that kept slipping slightly on her small head. She had practiced walking in it for weeks, but the real thing felt different somehow, heavier with meaning than the practice version. Every few steps, she would glance up at her mother for reassurance, finding comfort in Catherine's steady presence even as her own heart raced with nervous excitement. Little Louis, despite all the preparation and practice, remained wonderfully unpredictable. His eyes wide with amazement at the spectacular scene around him, he occasionally forgot to maintain the solemn expression he'd been taught, breaking into spontaneous smiles when he spotted familiar faces in the crowd. His genuine reactions brought warm chuckles from guests who remembered being children themselves, charmed by his authentic joy amidst such formal proceedings. As they took their designated seats in the front row, William's mind wandered to all the coronations this abbey had witnessed throughout the centuries. His grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, had sat in this same space over 70 years ago, a young woman taking on responsibilities she could never have fully understood at the time. Now was his father's turn, and someday, God willing many years from now, it would be his own. The ceremony began with the entrance of King Charles III, resplendent in his coronation robes, his face a mixture of solemnity and quiet pride. William watched his father process down the aisle and felt a surge of emotion that caught him off guard. This was the man who had taught him to fly fish, who had worried over his homework, who had held him when his mother died, now about to become the symbolic head of 16 nations and spiritual leader to hundreds of millions of people. Catherine reached over and took William's hand as the Archbishop of Canterbury began the ancient rituals that would transform Charles from heir to sovereign. The words echoed through the abbey, the same phrases that had been spoken for centuries, connecting this moment to a chain of history that stretched back to the Norman conquest. There was something both thrilling and overwhelming about being part of something so much larger than any individual life. During the anointing ceremony, when the cameras were respectfully turned away and the most sacred part of the coronation took place behind a golden canopy, the family sat in profound silence. Charlotte leaned against her mother's side, instinctively understanding that something deeply important was happening even if she couldn't see it. The mystery of the moment made it more powerful, a reminder that some aspects of monarchy transcended the public spectacle and touched something spiritual. George watched intently as his grandfather emerged from behind the canopy, transformed by the holy oil that had been used in coronations for generations. The boy was old enough to understand that he was witnessing history, that someday he would tell his own grandchildren about this day when the Second Elizabethan Age ended and the Caroline Age began. The responsibility of that future weighed on him, but also filled him with a quiet pride in his family's service to others. When the St. Edward's crown was finally placed upon King Charles's head, the moment was met with thunderous applause from the congregation and the sound of bells ringing across London. William felt tears prick his eyes as he watched his father's transformation from prince to king become official. In that instant, everything changed, not just for Charles but for their entire family. William was now heir apparent, his children next in line for the throne that would define their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. Catherine's emotions threatened to overwhelm her as she watched her father-in-law accept the symbols of his new office. The orb, the scepter, the ring, each item carried the weight of history and the promise of service to come. She thought about her own children and what their futures might hold, wondering if she was strong enough to help guide them through the unique challenges they would face as members of the royal family. The moment when the congregation shouted, "God, save the King," for the first time was electric, sending shivers through everyone present. Louis jumped slightly at the sudden noise, then smiled broadly as he joined in the chant, his small voice adding to the chorus that officially welcomed the new monarch. For him, this was still an adventure, an exciting game with wonderful costumes and loud celebrations. As the ceremony continued with the coronation of Queen Camilla, William reflected on how much his family had endured to reach this point. The years of criticism, the constant media attention, the personal tragedies that had played out in full view of the world, all had led to this moment of triumph and renewal. His stepmother, once vilified by the press, now stood before the altar receiving her own crown with dignity and grace that had won over even her harshest critics. The children watched Camilla's coronation with fascination, particularly Charlotte, who was captivated by the beauty of the queen consort's crown and the elegance of her movements. Despite being much simpler than the king's ceremony, there was something deeply moving about watching this woman, who had faced such public scrutiny, finally receive the recognition and respect she deserved. When the time came for the homage, William stepped forward with the other senior royals to pledge their loyalty to the new king. As he knelt before his father and spoke the ancient words of fealty, the personal and political merged in a way that was both profound and surreal. This was his father, the man who had bandaged his scraped knees and taught him to drive, but he was also now his sovereign, deserving of formal respect and obedience. I, William, Prince of Wales, do become your liege man of life and limb and of earthly worship, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the abbey's perfect acoustics. As he spoke these words that had been said by heirs for centuries, he felt the full weight of tradition settling upon his shoulders. Someday, perhaps decade from now, his own son would kneel before him and speak these same words. Catherine watched her husband's homage with tears in her eyes, understanding that in this moment, their family dynamic had shifted forever. William was no longer just a son. He was now heir to the throne, with all the obligations and expectations that entailed. Their children would grow up knowing that their father would someday be king, that their own futures were bound to the service of their nation. The most emotional moment came when the king's grandchildren were invited to approach the throne. George led his siblings forward, his young face serious with concentration as he remembered the protocol they had practiced. Charlotte curtsied perfectly, while Louis managed a reasonable bow despite his obvious excitement. King Charles's eyes shone with tears as he looked down at these three small people who represented the future of everything he had just sworn to protect. As the ceremony concluded with the national anthem, sung by 2,000 voices in perfect harmony, William looked around the abbey one final time before they would process out into their new lives. The faces of the congregation showed a mixture of hope, pride, and uncertainty about the future. Some were old enough to remember multiple coronations, others were witnessing their first. All understood that they were present for a moment that would be remembered and studied for generations to come. The recessional began with King Charles and Queen Camilla leading the way, followed by the Wales family. As they walked back down the aisle, William noticed how different the atmosphere felt from their entrance. Where there had been anticipation before, now there was a sense of accomplishment, of witnessing something truly historic. The ceremony was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Outside the abbey, the sound of cheering crowds grew louder with each step toward the doors. London had been transformed into a sea of red, white, and blue, with people celebrating in the streets despite the gray weather that threatened rain. The sight that awaited them beyond these ancient walls would be unlike anything the children had ever experienced. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered to celebrate their grandfather's coronation and to get a glimpse of the royal family on this historic day. The Golden State Coach emerged from the Abbey courtyard like something from a fairy tale, its ornate wheels rolling over cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of royal processions. Inside, the newly crowned King Charles III and Queen Camilla waved to the massive crowds lining the route, their faces glowing with the profound satisfaction of a duty finally fulfilled. Behind them, in a second ornate carriage, William's family began their journey through streets packed with celebrating citizens whose cheers created a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very buildings. William sat beside Catherine, both of them maintaining the composed expressions they had perfected over years of public appearances, but their eyes sparkled with genuine emotion as they witnessed the outpouring of joy from the British people. This was what all the preparation, all the sacrifice, all the careful protocol was truly about. These moments when the ancient institution of monarchy connected with the hearts of ordinary people who found hope and inspiration in the continuity of traditions. Charlotte pressed her small face to the carriage window, her eyes wide with amazement at the sheer number of people who had come to celebrate. She had never seen so many faces, so many flags, so many people all focused on her family with expressions of pure joy. Some held handmade signs with messages of congratulations. Others had painted the Union Jack on their cheeks, and children her own age waved frantically from their parents' shoulders, hoping to catch her attention. "Mummy, why are they all so happy?" Charlotte asked, her voice filled with wonder. The question struck Catherine deeply because it revealed the innocence that still existed within her daughter despite everything they had been through as a family. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes people need something larger than themselves to believe in, especially during difficult times? They're celebrating because they love our country and they're excited about Grandpa Charles being their new king, Catherine explained gently. When people see our family, they remember all the good things about being British, the history, the traditions, the way we help each other during hard times. We represent hope for them. George understood more than his siblings about the complex relationship between the royal family and the public. He had heard his parents discuss the responsibilities that came with their position, the way they had to balance their private feelings with their public duties. As he waved to the crowds, he felt the weight of their expectations settling upon him like an invisible cloak. These people believed in his family, trusted them to represent the best of their nation, and someday he would inherit that profound responsibility. The procession route took them through the heart of London, past landmarks that had witnessed countless royal celebrations throughout history. Trafalgar Square was a sea of humanity, with people climbing on statues and hanging from lampposts to get a better view. The noise was incredible. Not just cheering, but singing, the sound of military bands playing patriotic songs, and the constant clicking of thousands of cameras capturing every moment of this historic day. Little Louis bounced in his seat with excitement, completely captivated by the spectacle around him. At 5 years old, he had no understanding of the constitutional significance of what had just taken place, but he knew this was special because everyone was happy and celebrating. His infectious enthusiasm brought smiles to the faces of people in the crowd who could see his genuine joy through the carriage windows. "Look, Papa!" Louis exclaimed, pointing to a group of children who were jumping up and down trying to get his attention. Without thinking, he pressed both hands against the window and made a silly face that sent the young spectators into fits of giggles. William and Catherine exchanged amused glances, knowing that their youngest son's natural charm was exactly what the moment needed. As they turned on a Pall Mall, the crowd grew even denser, with people packed shoulder to shoulder as far as the eye could see. The Metropolitan Police had estimated that over 1 million people had come to central London for the coronation celebrations, making it one of the largest gatherings in British history. The sight was both thrilling and sobering. All these people had taken time from their lives, traveled from across the country and around the world to witness this ancient ceremony and celebrate the beginning of a new reign. Catherine found herself thinking about her own journey from a middle-class family in Berkshire to this golden carriage rolling through cheering crowds. The transformation had not been easy. Years of intense scrutiny, criticism of everything from her background to her fashion choices, constant speculation about her marriage and her children. But moments like this made all the challenges worthwhile, showing her the positive impact her family could have on people's lives. The diversity of the crowd was remarkable. Elderly people who remembered previous coronations sitting alongside young families experiencing their first royal celebration, tourists from dozens of countries mixing with locals who had lived in London all their lives. Union Jacks flew alongside flags from Commonwealth nations, creating a colorful tapestry that reflected the global nature of the modern monarchy. This was no longer just a British institution, but something that connected people across continents and cultures. William noticed a group of military veterans in the crowd, some in wheelchairs, others leaning on walking sticks, all wearing their service medals with obvious pride. Many had tears streaming down their faces as they watched the procession pass by. These were people who had served the crown during decades of peace and conflict, and seeing them honor his father's coronation reminded William of the deep bonds between the monarchy and those who had sacrificed for their country. As they approached Buckingham Palace, the crowds became even more enthusiastic, knowing that this was where the royal family would appear on the famous balcony for the traditional finale of the coronation celebrations. The mall was completely packed from the palace gates all the way to Admiralty Arch, a red carpet of humanity stretching into the distance. The sound of "God Save the King" rose from thousands of throats, creating a musical chorus that seemed to lift the very spirits of everyone present. Charlotte had been waving so enthusiastically that her arm was getting tired, but she couldn't stop herself from continuing. The energy of the crowd was infectious, and she found herself smiling so broadly that her cheeks hurt. This was unlike anything she had ever experienced, being part of something so joyful, so celebratory, so full of hope and optimism for the future. The carriage finally rolled through the gates of Buckingham Palace, entering the courtyard where hundreds of staff members stood applauding their arrival. These were the people who had worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this day possible. The housekeepers, gardeners, chefs, security officers, and countless others whose dedication kept the royal household functioning. Their applause felt different from the crowd's enthusiasm, more personal, more intimate, recognizing the family behind the public figures. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was electric with accomplishment and relief. The coronation had gone flawlessly, without a single major mishap or embarrassing moment. The children had behaved beautifully, the ceremony had been deeply moving, and the public response had exceeded everyone's most optimistic expectations. Now came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the balcony appearance that would cap off this historic day. William helped his children out of their formal coronation robes and into slightly more comfortable outfits for the balcony appearance, though they remained dressed formally enough for the millions of people who would see them. Charlotte's tiara was adjusted one final time, George's military uniform was straightened, and Louis was reminded about the importance of staying still during the national anthem. "Remember," William said to his children as they prepared to walk out onto the balcony, "this is our chance to thank all those people for coming to celebrate with us. They've waited hours in the rain. Some of them camped out all night just to see our family. We want to show them how much we appreciate their support." Catherine took a deep breath as they approached the balcony doors, knowing that stepping outside would trigger one of the loudest roars of approval they had ever heard. The balcony appearance was one of the most iconic moments in royal tradition, the image that would be replayed on news broadcasts around the world and preserved in history books forever. As King Charles and Queen Camilla stepped onto the balcony first, the sound from the crowd below was deafening. Even inside the palace, the walls seemed to vibrate with the force of 500,000 voices cheering in unison. This was the moment the public had been waiting for, the chance to see their new king and queen in the place where royal families had celebrated momentous occasions for generations. When William's family joined them on the balcony, the crowd's enthusiasm reached a fever pitch. The sight of 3 generations of the royal family standing together against the backdrop of the palace facade created a powerful symbol of continuity and hope for the future. Photographers captured thousands of images, but none could truly convey the emotional power of this moment. A family united in service to their nation, standing before their people with gratitude and determination to serve them well. The evening light cast a golden glow across the palace gardens as the last of the coronation guests departed, leaving behind the echoes of laughter, music, and celebration that had filled the air throughout this extraordinary day. Inside the private apartments, William's family finally had a moment to breathe, to process what they had just experienced, and to begin adjusting to the reality that their lives had fundamentally changed with the placing of a crown upon his father's head. Charlotte sat curled up in her favorite armchair, still wearing her ceremonial dress, but with her tiara carefully placed on a nearby table. Her small fingers traced the intricate patterns on the fabric as she replayed the day's events in her mind. The magnitude of what she had witnessed was beyond her full comprehension, but she understood that something important had happened, something that connected her family to every person who had cheered from the crowds lining the streets of London. "Mummy," she said quietly, looking up at Catherine with eyes that seemed older than her 8 years. "When I grow up, will people expect me to be as good as great-granny Elizabeth was?" The question hung in the air like a delicate crystal, beautiful and fragile and profound in its innocence. Catherine felt her heart constrict as she realized her daughter was beginning to understand the weight of expectations that would shape her entire life. How do you answer such a question without crushing a child's spirit or filling them with overwhelming pressure? Catherine knelt beside Charlotte's chair and took her small hands in her own. Great-Granny Elizabeth spent her whole life learning how to serve people, how to be kind and strong and wise. She made mistakes sometimes, just like everyone does, but she never stopped trying to do what was right. If you spend your life being the best person you can be, helping others when they need it, and always being honest and kind, that's all anyone could ask for. George sat by the window, still processing everything he had witnessed during the balcony appearance. The sight of hundreds of thousands of people cheering specifically for his family had been overwhelming in ways he struggled to articulate. These weren't just strangers celebrating a historical event. These were people who somehow felt connected to his grandfather, his father, and even to him, a 10-year-old boy who just wanted to play football and read adventure stories. "Dad," George said, turning away from the window where the last clusters of celebrating crowds were finally beginning to disperse. "How do you handle knowing that so many people are counting on you? What if we disappoint them?" William walked over to his son and placed a hand on his shoulder, remembering asking his own father similar questions when he was George's age. The fear of disappointing people, of not living up to the legacy of those who came before, was something every royal child struggled with. It was a burden that couldn't be completely lifted, but it could be shared and understood. "You know what your great-grandmother once told me?" William said, settling into the chair beside George. "She said that the secret isn't to never make mistakes. It's to learn from them when you do, to always apologize when you're wrong, and to never stop caring about people. She said that as long as we remember we're here to serve others, not to be served by them, we'll find our way through even the most difficult times." Louis had fallen asleep in Catherine's arms during the quiet conversation, exhausted by the excitement and emotion of the longest, most important day of his young life. His peaceful expression as he slept reminded the family that despite all the ceremony and tradition, despite the weight of history and expectation, they were still fundamentally a family trying to love and protect each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. The private dinner that followed was a stark contrast to the grand state banquet that had taken place earlier in the evening. Here, in the informal dining room with its comfortable chairs and family photographs, the newly crowned King Charles shared a simple meal with his son's family. Finally, able to speak openly about the day's events without the constant awareness of watching eyes and listening ears. "I kept thinking about Mama during the ceremony," King Charles said, using the private name he had always called Queen Elizabeth. "How proud she would have been to see you children behaving so beautifully. How she would have smiled at Louis's enthusiasm during the procession. I felt her presence throughout the entire day, as if she were still guiding us through this transition." The mention of their beloved great-grandmother brought tears to Charlotte's eyes. Queen Elizabeth had been a constant presence in their lives, the anchor that had held the family steady through every storm. Her death 6 months earlier had left a void that seemed impossible to fill, but today had shown them that her influence, her example, and her love continued to guide them, even in her absence. "I miss her too, Grandpa," Charlotte said softly. "But I think she was watching today. When I was walking in the Abbey, I felt like she was right there beside me, helping me remember how to curtsy properly and when to smile." The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared before. For the first time, King Charles spoke to his grandchildren not just as a grandfather, but as their sovereign, explaining what his new role would mean for their family and how their own responsibilities would evolve as they grew older. He spoke gently, but honestly about the sacrifices they would all need to make, the constant scrutiny they would face, and the importance of supporting each other through the unique challenges of royal life. "The crown isn't just a piece of jewelry," he explained to George, who was old enough to begin understanding these complexities. "It represents a promise to put the needs of our people before our own wants, to serve rather than be served, to be an example of what's best in our nation, even when it's difficult. Someday, that promise will pass to your father, and eventually to you. But you don't have to carry that weight alone. We're a family, and families help each other." As the evening progressed, they shared stories and memories, laughed about the day's small mishaps, and marveled at the incredible response from the public. The children gradually began to relax, returning to their normal selves as the formality of the day gave way to the comfort of family time. Louis woke up refreshed and immediately began reenacting the coronation ceremony, using his dinner roll as a crown, bringing much-needed laughter to the conversation. William and Catherine exchanged glances across the table, both recognizing that this dinner marked the beginning of a new chapter for their family. Tomorrow, they would wake up in a world where William was heir apparent to the throne, where their children's futures were even more clearly defined by the expectations of royal service. The transition wouldn't be easy, but they faced it together, as they had faced every challenge in their marriage. Later, as they tucked their children into bed, each parent took time for private conversations that would become the foundation for how their family would navigate their new reality. Catherine sat with Charlotte, talking about the difference between being royal and being human, emphasizing that kindness and authenticity were more important than perfect protocol. William spent time with George, beginning the conversations that would help prepare him for his eventual role while ensuring he had space to be a child for as long as possible. The night was quiet as William and Catherine finally had a moment alone together, standing on their private balcony overlooking the gardens where security lights cast long shadows across perfectly manicured lawns. In the distance, they could still hear the faint sounds of celebration from various parts of London, where people continued to mark this historic day in pubs and restaurants, in homes and community centers, wherever groups had gathered to witness the coronation together. "Do you think we're ready for this?" Catherine asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder as they looked out at the city that would always be watching their family's every move. "I don't think anyone could ever be completely ready for what lies ahead," William replied honestly. "But I think we have what matters most. We love each other, we understand why this matters to people, and we're committed to serving something larger than ourselves. Our children will grow up knowing their purpose, understanding their responsibilities, but also feeling secure in our love and support." They stood in comfortable silence, both reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. From university students to the most watched family in the world, from private individuals to public servants, from a young couple in love to parents responsible for preparing the next generation of monarchs. The path had been filled with challenges, criticism, and moments of doubt, but it had also been blessed with purpose, service, and the opportunity to make a positive difference in millions of lives. Inside the palace, their 3 children slept peacefully, dreaming perhaps of the crowds and ceremonies, the music and celebration that had filled their day. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities, new expectations, and new opportunities to serve their nation and the Commonwealth. But tonight they were simply a family that had shared an extraordinary day together, united by love and strengthened by the knowledge that whatever the future held, they would face it as they had faced this day, with grace, courage, and unwavering commitment to each other and to the people who had placed their trust in the institution they represented. The coronation was complete, but the real work of their new reign was just beginning. And as the stars appeared over London, casting their ancient light on a city celebrating its new king, William's family prepared to step forward into a future that would test their strength, challenge their resolve, and ultimately reveal the true depth of their dedication to serving others with grace, dignity, and love.